Hi, everyone. I'm Monica Chan with Proofpoint. Thank you for joining us today for our featured webinar on protecting your people and data, featuring Forrester's Zero Trust Framework. There are just a few housekeeping items I'd like to go over with you before we begin. All lines have been muted, but we will be taking questions at the end, so enter any questions or comments you have into the chat box below the presentation screen. This session will be available on demand for you to watch at any time by visiting the same URL that was sent to you after the session is over. And if you are experiencing any audio issues, just follow the troubleshooting guide below the presentation screen or double check your internet connection. Today we have two very special guests with us as our speakers, Chase Cunningham from Forrester, the Principal Analyst for Forrester, and Ryan Callenber, our EVP of Cybersecurity at Proofpoint. We're excited to have both of them with us today, and with that, I'll turn it over to Chase.
Hey, great. Thank you very much for having me. This should be a interesting session. I'm going to get into zero trust and kind of how this plays into the user side of the equation, as well as how the framework can be applied in this context. So we're going to talk mainly about overview, strategy side of this equation. Promise I'm not going to throw anybody through a whole bunch of firewall rules and configurations or detailed IAM policy-based stuff, but we'll get through this and get through the content. So I get the question all the time during workshops. I just did a big thing here in DC on Capitol Hill. We've done workshops internationally where the common question is, tell us what the definition of zero trust is. Now, I have to caveat that with, I honestly think that even though Forrester coined the term zero trust about a decade or so ago, with a real strategy, there is no necessarily biblical definition of zero trust. This is kind of my humble definition of it, and I think it's pretty broadly applicable. But what we talk about here is the tagline that you've probably seen in media and news articles and whatever, where zero trust is never trust, always verify. Now, the definition, in my opinion, is zero trust is strategically focused on addressing lateral threat movement within the network by leveraging microsegmentation. And I mean microsegmentation here in the much grander context than just firewalls, and granular enforcement based on user context, data access controls, location, application, and the device posture. What that really means is that those are the 7 core components of what zero trust is composed of, in our opinion, based on research and a decade's worth of data and interactions and workshops and those things to back that up. But the takeaway is your organization may not necessarily have all of those things all the time that they have to be responsible for no matter what. The great thing about a real grand strategic approach, about a big time definition, about the benefits of an actual strategy, is that you can take this thing and kind of make it your own. I think that some of the most important pieces of that definition is addressing lateral threat movement, not allowing bad things to go from bad to cataclysmic because of shares, excessive privileges, users doing things that they shouldn't be doing or having access to things they shouldn't have, and being able to figure out how to apply segmentation, micro-segmentation with policy at the granular level across as much of that infrastructure as you possibly can. If you do those things correctly, in the future state, hopefully what you can get to is a world where you don't have to worry about usernames and passwords anymore. That's why I have that image there, because there are capabilities that are present now in the market that are aligned with zero trust strategically that can help eliminate the problems that we have around users and authentication and passwords and all these basic things that are really problematic in the context of cybersecurity. So that is the Forrester definition of zero trust. That is my stake in the ground. I wouldn't stand up in a room full of a bunch of people and say, thou shalt have no other definitions except for this, because it's a reality of a real strategy, is everyone can have their own kind of flavor of the same ice cream. So I really hope that this is applicable in most organizations. I think that it is based on research, but this is one of the few times since we started kicking things off in 2020 where we've had the opportunity to actually put the definition, our opinion, the definition out there. So we have a polling question, and this is just to get a little bit of audience feedback, a little bit of veracity on this. Does that definition of zero trust make sense? You either agree or disagree. And now that's a bit broad, but the point is just to kind of get this out there and see if we are way off target or if we're somewhere close to where we'd like to be.
So folks, you will see that on your screen. The poll has popped up. If you could just cast your votes in, it's just going to be one click away.
So I'll give that about 10 or 15 seconds to kind of chew through there. So as you put your votes in and respond to that, let me give you a little bit more history on zero trust and actually maybe give you some insight on this has been around longer than most people are aware of. So most people are aware that Forrester, John Kindervag, kind of coined the term around zero trust back in roughly 2010-ish time frame, 2011-ish time frame, and that was based on John's observation of the Jericho Forum. Now, the Jericho Forum, this was the earliest reference I could find, sort of formal slide deck on their particular position of what that actually meant. And they talked about architecture for deperimeterized security, and this was in 2007. They actually started this whole thing in 2004. So if you really wanted to go back to the soup to nuts, very earliest instance of this, the first time that it had ever kind of came across, bubbling through people's heads and winding up on a whiteboard, it would have been roughly around 2004. So you can think about this is an industry standard sort of strategic approach that's been around for over a decade and a half, and is still viable, is still applicable. So, I think the original idea, the concept there was grand enough that it lasted this long. And the good thing is now we've reached a space where technology has finally caught up to where we're at with capability. So the idea has also evolved pretty substantially since that first iteration of this a long time ago. 2004, the Jericho Forum was basically formally established. 2004's time frame was when NACS kind of came around and really became a bit more of a formalized security control capability within the network itself. 2010, fast forward 5 or 6 years, Forrester, John Kindervag says, that deperimeterized security thing makes a lot of sense. I think I can go bigger with this, so let's just call it zero trust. And that was the kind of line in the sand there. And then moving forward from there, 2014 to 2015, we really started to see the big companies out there, Beyond Corp, which was Google's implementation, Microsoft pushing their assumed breach thing into their architecture and infrastructure. So that was kind of the first broad practical proof that this was an approach that makes a lot of sense. And then it's evolved even further from there. 2016, really get into the conditional access control capabilities being released. 2017, a bunch of guys wrote a really good book on this, which, by the way, if you haven't read it and you're into zero trust, I would say go check it out with the lobster on there for some weird reason. And then now we're really moving into the space where the future state of zero trust is working on getting rid of the very basic problems that we have in security by bolting in communications technology capabilities around enabling better user access controls and those type of things. And if you go from the bottom part there to where we are now, it was originally really heavy on network, but we know now with BYOD, with the future of work, that the network is no longer clearly definable. The moment you have BYOD or any of these people logging onto your system from the coffee shop, the network has effectively disappeared. So that's why it's moved to this new state where it's really around identity is probably going to be where this whole thing winds up starting. If you look at the practical guide that we published on how to get to zero trust, you look at the research around how organizations are dealing with this, identity seems a problem, and the users seem to be a problem that is potentially easier to solve from the start than the network, just because of the dynamism and change that takes place. Just to provide a little bit of clarity on what this thing actually looks like, this is not, again, this is not a biblical definition. This is not a biblical reference architecture, but this is a sample architecture. And I think what the takeaway here should be for folks that are interested in ZT is that there are reference architectures out there that are available. There are people that are putting in lots of time and effort into publishing these things. There are virtual architectures. The stuff is there to say, kind of how do we go from theory and concept to practical application. And now what you notice in this one, and this is Microsoft's sort of version of a reference architecture, is they're really segmenting things up based on identity, device. They have the visibility analytics down at the bottom and automation, and you can see on the right data, applications, infrastructure, and network with that policy enforcement capability in the middle tied through everything. And the great thing to me about this is a company as large as Microsoft is able to look at the framework that Forrester's put out based on all this research and all this background and say, how do we carve up our particular version of this and make it work for our massive enterprise? And they've done that right here. You can see very clearly what goes where the correlation happens, where decision engines are taking place, and where the outcome will be. And it's all tied together at the very bottom via visibility and analytics. So this is a collective, broader approach to architecture, and it's just proof in the pudding that the strategy is applicable, the framework is usable, and zero trust is achievable if it's taken in very, very granular steps to get there. Now, I won't say that Microsoft is a zero trust infrastructure currently, but I know from lots of work with them that they're working on it. So big companies, going to take them a long time to get there. Massive organizations like the DoD are also working on this. For some of them, it's a 10-year plan, and that's okay. We've got 30 years of failure. If we can get to a better place in 10, that's kind of like a 3x return on our efforts. So the benefits really of having a grand strategy like this, having something that's got the long life cycle, has been applicable for almost 2 decades, at least a decade and a half, is that the single strategy is there for long-term success. This is not something that you wake up and do. This is not a just one and done. This is a strategy. It takes a long time. And the reason that this is taking off the way that it is because people have finally realized that being compliant is not a security strategy. Being secure is not a security strategy. Everyone wants to do those things, and you have to be compliant, but if compliance and being secure worked were the strategic benefits and beat the bad guys, we wouldn't continue to have the breaches that we have today. Most of those were either fully compliant or fully quote secure environments. And then getting more controls, more technology is not a strategy. I tell people in workshops all the time, you can't buy your way to zero trust. You just can't do it. Just like you can't go to the GNC and buy every supplement on the shelf and take it and never work out and look like a supermodel or a bodybuilder. You can't do that. It doesn't matter how much you throw at the problem. It's got to be used correctly with a formula for an outcome, and there's got to be work involved to get to that state. So, to be perfectly clear on this whole thing, zero trust is one strategy with multiple avenues over a long life cycle. That's where we're trying to get to. That's where the industry seems to be aligning. That's where the big governments and DODs and the big banks and the big healthcare are also seeing benefit and value from this, because this is a long-term thing. It took 30 to 40 years to get to where we are now. It's going to take a while to dig ourselves out of this hole. And there are some basic tenets that we'd like to remind people of the benefit of the strategy, of the framework, and how it's applicable. So what we talk to people about and getting into zero and figuring out how it applies to them is really focusing on the outcomes. For a long time, without grand strategic initiatives in place, we've all focused on what we're doing. We've all focused on the thing that we're solving right now. We never really focused on the outcome. And in security should be a business enabler. It should not be the department of no. And the way that we get to that is focusing on, well, what am I going to do over here that's going to benefit the company, that's not going to slow things down and is going to make it better, where we're able to operate more securely so that we're better in the future. You got to focus on the outcomes, and you got to have a plan for how you're going to get to that next step. We want to work on designing from the inside and out, the micro to the macro. This is a flip on the script of basically big high walls, keeping the bad guys out, and thinking that we're safe and secure. The ground that you gain The beachhead, if you will, is inside of the infrastructure where you do have a foothold and you can work your way outward. And if you do that correctly, as you progress through this whole process, you wind up turning on lights in dark corners that you weren't able to see into before. And eventually you run the cockroaches out of there because they have nowhere left to hide. But you have to go from the inside to the outside, not from the outside to the inside. And then being able to focus on assets and data that needs protection. Now, this is something that pragmatically Forrester is working on over the course of the next year to actually redefine what we mean by that center bullet there of data. Data no longer is just a line item in a spreadsheet or an entry in a database or something like that. Data is much bigger than that. Data is actually your formula for Coca-Cola, your intellectual property, the way that you do business. So we're working on defining exactly what that sort of new flavor of that term in the center will be, because this space has evolved way beyond that. But the point is, you want to focus on securing your crown jewels, if you will, and then being able to know that that is, if everything goes to hell in a handbasket, that's where the survivability will be. And then lastly, these three things that tie together determine who or what needs access, the users, what they need to do their jobs, what they should be accessing. They should have least privileges, and it should only be in a context of need to know, and you should be inspecting and logging all traffic, but you have to be able to do that with a focus on outcomes from that apply to who or what needs access to those critical assets, and they should have least privilege apply as well. And it's got to be able to be done dynamically. So those are the main tenets of the new ZTX framework, and those are what we find based on our interactions with our clients are the most broadly applicable to the problem. Now, folks can argue that they think that they've built high walls and that they'll keep the bad guys out, but I mean, history says that that's wrong. It just doesn't apply anymore. The secure perimeter concept has categorically failed us. It is no longer defensible. Secure perimeter looks just like this. It doesn't get any more comical when you actually think about it. I mean, somebody actually went to the time in this quote secure perimeter to put a lock on something that had a piece of plastic holding it together. So, thinking that you're going to live in a world where we are BYOD, where everyone's mobile, where we don't have defensible endpoints anymore and everything is more dynamic, the prince for the secure perimeter just does not apply. And it's not just us that's saying that. We actually went out and did research to back this up, and we asked organizations across the planet, do you feel that the network perimeter is defensible? And more than half of them came back and said, it's indefensible in today's technology ecosystem, distributed cloud workloads, and mobile remote users. So anytime you get, a group of technologists in a room and more than half of them agree with you, that's a win. That means there's something there. And then on the other side, asking organizations that want to digitally transform, which all of us do, digital transformation necessitates an adjustment to that traditional perimeter-based security strategy. 84% of the people we talk to there. I mean, so that's basically almost 9 out of 10 folks, 8 out of 10 folks said flat out, like, if we're going to be digital, if we're going to transform, if we're going to live in a more cloudy world, more BYOD, bigger, better, faster, we have to change the way that we do security, because the network perimeter is no longer defensible. Today's technology ecosystem is more complex by digital transformation, requires an adjustment to that strategy. If you want to be a viable entity in the near future, and you are relying on having a secure perimeter as your strategic approach to security, you will fail. You cannot simply stay in that old quagmire and think that you'll get better. It doesn't matter how high you build the wall, there will always be a taller ladder. Now, just to provide some veracity on the, this is not just something that we're thinking of and that we're putting all the information out on. We actually made sure that there is a market for zero trust tools and technologies, and that there are line items showing up in budgets across the globe. So we went and told market data and came back with some referenceable material that says that there is an actual growth rate for zero trust technologies over the course of the next year. There's a CAGR associated with it, like there is investment going in there. There are factors that are increasing and decreasing. This is a very real world thing. It is an actual market. There are line items, there are budget items, there are technologies and solutions that map directly into it. And it's not just a research group, a bunch of analysts saying that this is what it is. there's viable data out there on the internet across the globe that says that this is real. And when I say across the globe, I mean internationally. So we've pulled that stuff together, zero trust security by region. You can tell North America, Europe, APAC, and then the rest of the world, and it gets up into the $38 billion sort of range. And that's probably a little bit less than what I would think it is globally too. It's probably even more than that because there's lots of technologies that can apply in this space. And that's all the way up to 2024. So there is a market, there are numbers, there are data, there is referenceable material going into this, and it's not just coming from us. So that's great because that means it's globally applicable and it's valuable enough that people are actually putting budget and line items into it to address the issue. Now, when you look at that security budget, when you look at where it is, this is from globally looking at the budget. What you saw a few years ago, a year and a half ago, before people could say where their ZT budgets were aligning and how they were going to put money into solving the problem based on the strategy, was literally, I call this the hedge your bet slide. And you could look at this and tell from across the room, everything in here is within 0.01 percentage points or 0.1 percentage point of each other. What does that mean? Well, that means if you got $100, you're taking 10 of it and carving it up for this and 10 and carving it up for that until you have an even keel across the board. And that might make sense, but in reality, what you're doing is you're hedging your bets, hoping that you put enough budget into enough buckets to solve the problem, when in reality, there are problems that are more applicable to solve first or more applicable to solve because of the context of the business that would align with the ZT strategic approach, and they should be larger parts of that pie. Now, when you do a current run through and you actually look at the companies that have aligned with ZT and where they're putting their money, where they're allocating that budget from that spend, you can see that there is a difference. So if you go, back to the slide before with folks that aren't strategically aligned, they're throwing basically 10% across the board, hoping they hit the target. And if you talk with the folks that are aligned on ZT strategically, you can see there are larger pieces of budget going into larger pieces of capabilities. And what you'll notice is that devices and workloads is actually larger than what you would see with some of these other solution sets, because those are where the threats exist and are more directly referenceable and are more, it's easier to interface with the threats further outside of that perimeter. So there is a definite difference between non-alignment and budget allocation and actual alignment and budget allocation to focus on fixing problems that you can get to with solutions that enable the strategy. So another polling question here. A couple folks said that they couldn't get the polling to work before, but maybe it'll work for you this time. Sometimes if you have like a pop-up blocker, it can stop that. But again, this is a broad question, but it's just to drive the point home that most people are trying to at least align to a strategy, not just more budget. So polling question is, I plan on aligning my budget to a security strategy. Yes or no? I would really hope that this one comes back with yes in most instances, but we'll see. And just the last few things here really on ZT and kind of the progression where we're at now is Forrester has done about a year's worth of research to come up with a maturity model. And if you look at this maturity model, what you can notice is we're taking our framework, we're figuring out based on that framework what the maturity phase of an organization looks like. And then we're looking at it over the course of a 10-year life cycle and saying, if you're this level of maturity, you're at this phase in ZT, these are the solutions that you should put in place, and these are the solutions that map to that framework that will solve that problem. And if you go from the bottom left to the top right, you can tell the progression starts with things like the users, and then moves into the users and cloud resources, and then gets into the users and the network, and then finally you're getting into the users and devices and data, and it continues to progress from there. So there's a difference in this whole thing. There is a difference in the change of the approach. If you took the original model for ZT 10 years ago and you mapped it to this one now, you would see that they're almost diametrically opposed, like they're running orthogonal to each other, because we didn't do it that way back then. It was network, 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 data, data, data. And now, based on the capabilities and tools, technologies that are available, it moves from users to cloud to networks to data, because that's where the problems are easiest to fix, and that's where there is an easier progression to solve the actual issues. We don't want to continue to chase our tails trying to fix things that we can't necessarily gain ground on. And we've gone a level deeper to that too, because we had so many people asking us about, like, well, how would we do this? What would our plan look like? How would we select tools and technologies to map it to the phases, and et cetera. And part of that whole research example that we put out, again, it took us a year to do, was really running through in those phases which things go where, which problems are we solving, and then how are we aligning different capabilities and offerings within the market itself to help get to that next state. And you can crawl through this and see that we talk about budget allotment, we talk about executive engagement, we talk about technology selection. So point being, this is a great way to get your head kind of around the practical guide and application of a zero trust roadmap, and how to map the framework into that so that you can solve these problems. And it shows you kind of which problems to solve first, and then you can figure out which solutions solve that problem. And then, I want to remind people that there is, we said this earlier, but there's no way to buy your way to being secure. We've already spent billions and billions of dollars. It continues to go up. 93 billion was spent in 2018. We're over 100 billion, I think, now in 2019, and continuing to go up. So it's not that we haven't spent enough money. We've spent plenty of money, so it's got to be a problem strategy. If you're going to be at RSA this year, I think the numbers I saw for RSA were something like 700 vendors. There's not 700 problems in security. Like, the technology, the money, the capability is all there. It's how it's leveraged strategically to address the issue that actually makes the difference. And the reasons why we think that the users and their devices are something that needs to be solved very early on in that whole life cycle and process is because BYOD is the future of work. Across industries, you can see that there is an exponentially larger growth of devices that are owned by users that are going to be touching networks, touching infrastructure, and that's where the bad guys are going to live and operate, because it's an easier avenue for exploitation. So BYOD, being the future of work, mandates the approach change and take care of users and devices first, because that's where the battle is going to be fought way before they ever get into the network and the infrastructure. You want to stop them before they get in the door, not after they're already in the door. And we can't secure things the way that we used to in the past. Folks don't use PCs anymore. Most people, if they use PCs, it's just for gaming, things like that. The reality of where things are going in BYOD and the new sort of mobile world, the traditional endpoint stuff doesn't necessarily apply anymore. It's got to be more dynamic, more cloud, more user focused, pushed out as far outside of the bounds of the perimeter as possible, so that you keep the control there and you're able to really vector in and respond and remediate the problems as fast as possible, as far outward of the enterprise as possible. And those applications that are there are also a pretty key piece of this. That's why you see the progression in the life cycle and the guide to getting into the workload side, because workloads live in the cloud. That's where your productivity lies. So if you look up there, email, word processing, those are probably two of the greatest, most beneficial things that we use daily for most of us in work. If you can't take care of email, you can't take care of the word processing generation, some of the spreadsheet stuff, the intellectual property generation via those applications that live and breathe in cloud resources and on endpoints, then you don't have a way to really secure the infrastructure. Like we said earlier, there's the days of data and value being derived solely from things either line item on a spreadsheet or record in a database. Those don't apply anymore. We've evolved so far past that. And lastly, in reality, where security is best, and security, especially around the zero trust, is best, is when it's lightweight, unified, and contextual. Lightweight means the users are not impacted, but they are operating in a secure manner. You push controls to them so that you can have manage, maintain, and controllability of those assets, but you're not making them miserable, because the first thing you try and do when you're miserable in security is go around it, which negates the benefit anyway. It's got to be unified because we want information, we want data, we want telemetry, we want metrics, and we want to be able to know what's going on, and we need it to go across my mobile device to my laptop to my corporate network, et cetera. It's got to be a unified control plane. And then lastly, it's got to be contextual. Analytics without context, analytics and telemetry without action on the far side of it is just paralysis analysis. It's not actually doing much for you. In most cases, that's actually causing more of a problem than fixing. So we want contextual information that comes from a unified platform that is lightweight and doesn't bog the user down. That's what the perfect sort of state in an end user zero trust sort of environment will look like. And lastly, I'll say that if you're, and this is not just, pitching Forrester, but really the point is there is certifications out there that if you're interested in actually speaking the same language that the industry is speaking on zero trust, there are certifications that are out there. There are practical real world examples with lots of run through on the totality of the picture that you can go through that will give you a little bit of insight into how this whole thing has evolved and where we're at now and where we're going forward. So, if you're interested in that, I would say check this thing out. I think it's a pretty solid certification. And we do have actual virtual references, architectures in there to provide veracity and show people like this is what a zero trust infrastructure looks like. And it speaks to those lightweight, contextual, unified approaches and benefits within that certification program. So thank you very much. I appreciate you all taking the time.
Thanks, Chase. That was fantastic. So good to speak with you all. I'm Ryan Calver, as Monica introduced earlier. And I'm going to go into some of the practical applications of the concepts that Chase just took us through. But first, I wanted to start with a polling question, and I'll tell a little story while you all answer that. If you actually click on that Back to List button that's there in your polling tab, you should be able to see this one. But the question is, what are you least likely to want to trust? The user, the device, the network, the application, or the cloud? I think we would have gotten radically different answers to this a few years ago, but it is nonetheless a question that still bears asking. I do want to, again, tell a brief story here. Chase mentioned the Jericho Forum and really the history of zero trust, which I think is a fascinating topic, not least of which because I actually had a front row seat to that history. I was at the second ever meeting of the Jericho Forum, which actually happened in London. I believe Cisco hosted the first one, officially speaking. There's a guy actually who was a CISO of the Royal Mail at the time who was really one of the driving forces behind the Jericho Forum and that use of the wonderfully polysyllabic word deperimeterization. I'm very glad, actually, despite all of the abuses in the marketing world, that we're now talking about zero trust, because it is a whole lot easier to say than deperimeterization, although shockingly, a lot of the concepts remain exactly the same as they were in 2004. Even back then, it was easier to compromise a user, to phish someone, and get access within a big, flat enterprise network to the thing that you were actually after, even back then, 16 years ago, than it was to maybe go through more difficult channels, finding novel exploits in web-facing applications, popping the web servers, getting a web shell, pivoting over to something it's talking to. That's a huge pain. And I think actually the survey answers, as they are shaping up here, bear that out as well. Fully two-thirds of you are least likely to want to trust the user, which I can't say users have done much to dissuade you from not wanting to trust them, but it is absolutely characteristic of the threat landscape that it is targeted at people and mainly works by social engineering. But that's not the topic today. We want to go into some of the practical applications of zero trust and actually why, to Chase's point earlier, starting with users and devices makes so much sense. And Chase gave you some fantastic stats, so I won't spend too much time on this, but if you're really drawing a high-level picture of your world, it just looks radically different than it did before. You often have managed or personal devices going straight to public cloud, straight to SaaS apps, Some stuff still lives in the data center for those of us who built our infrastructures longer than, say, 5 years ago. And there are some companies that have been founded relatively recently that are quite literally born in the cloud, where they've never bought a firewall, nor should they. They've never bought a server and wouldn't consider it. So their architectures end up looking a little different. And some of the ways that they've implemented Zero Trust have some interesting lessons for the rest of us. But let's talk about a couple of the baseline assumptions here. First, employees are working off-premise at least some of the time, and you can't trust where they are working from. Secondly, you can probably assure yourself that in a company of a reasonable size, they're not even all going to be your employees. You're going to have contractors, you're going to have third parties, you're going to have partners, all of whom are going to have access to something that is technically yours, whether that is a SaaS application, something that lives in a public cloud, or something that lives in your data center. And then finally, your applications are somewhere in a state of migration to the cloud. Most of that would probably happen via classic lift and shift. Maybe you took your Exchange servers and moved them to Office 365 or G Suite, but overall, the places that data lives are gradually transitioning out of that data center, broadly speaking. So with that as a baseline assumption, you're talking about moving the perimeter to some extent, because Zero Trust doesn't necessarily imply that there is no perimeter of any kind. You do still have to make access control decisions. And in our view, one of the most powerful ways you can do that is by thinking of it less in terms of a network access control decision and more in terms of a user and device access control decision. One of the other reasonable definitions of Zero Trust is, in fact, your perimeter is everywhere you make an access control decision. So let's talk about that human attack surface, though, because clearly 2/3 of you really don't like trusting your users because you frankly don't have a good reason to. Because at this point, the threat landscape would tell you that it is a bad idea to, in fact, trust your users too much, and you frankly want to protect them. So we think about actually understanding a human attack surface as one of the key places to really go to start a Zero Trust journey in a way that starts to shrink what can look like a really challenging problem. You know, if you looked at that fantastic reference architecture that Chase shared, and you tried to map it up to the Visio diagram of your current network connected to a bunch of clouds, it probably wouldn't look very, very similar. And you'd have a long way to go from here to there. And that's why I think that roadmap that Forrester defined is spot on, that this might be a 10-year journey. But, you know, no matter how long the journey is, it starts with a simple step. And so when it comes to that simple step, one of the things that I've seen a lot of success around is actually figuring out what your human attack surface looks like. Basically, who's getting targeted by serious threats, who's likely to fall for those threats, and then critically, who represents risk to the organization, who can access those crown jewels. So in the spirit of Chase talking about the inside-out methodology for understanding things, if you have somebody who's highly attacked, who's likely to fall for those attacks, and also can access critical systems or sensitive data, or they have local admin so that they can be a vector for the original thing that we were trying to solve with Zero Trust and deperimeterization, which was, of course, lateral movement. Or maybe they're a contractor and a third party, and you can't trust them simply because of who they are. And that they shouldn't, frankly, have access to more than a couple of different systems. All of those things are different flavors of risk. Most of the time, you can also identify them without a long, laborious process to track back to the ultimate thing that you're trying to protect. So this is the sort of thing that in broad terms, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it is a key way to kind of understand the whole context of the problem. You might actually consider part of a people-centric security strategy, Zero Trust being one of the key ways in which that is implemented, where you're looking to obviously protect people from the threats that end up targeting them, which again, is a fairly critical thing. And maybe those 66% of you who don't want to trust the user might actually invest in something like training to perhaps make those users a little bit more resilient against the threats that target them, or at least train them in terms of sensitive data handling and trying to do less to evade properly constructed security controls. But really it is that third side of things that I think is the most meaningful. Once you've protected people and made them more resilient, that hasn't solved the whole problem. They still have access to things that matter to you, whether that's data or whether that's system access. So there's all kinds of things you can do to then further protect people, whether that's classic things like data loss prevention, maybe you isolate their browsing because these people can't stop clicking on things, or perhaps they have to have access to something, but you want to make sure that they only have access to the thing that they're supposed to have in the spirit of zero trust. So really that's what we think of as the third leg of the stool when it comes to an overall people-centric strategy. But the topic is not on people-centric today, it's about people-centric zero trust access. So let's talk about specifically what that would look like. Now, interestingly, in working with maybe not quite as many organizations as Chase, but quite a few organizations on how to solve this problem, they really take a couple of different paths. One is to identify your risky users, and sometimes that's driven by, again, what they have access to. Sometimes it's driven by who they are. And then the next step is, of course, to limit their access to only what they need. And that's easier said than done, for sure. But in our view, the right way to do that is identity-based. Chase was spot on when he said identity will lead the charge to zero trust. And frankly, you want this to be, in most cases, a cloud service because, again, you have cloud assets as well as prem assets. And it's, of course, got to be micro-segmented. The other way to look at this problem, though, is that you might also take a different on-ramp. So maybe you're identifying your risky users and limiting their access, and maybe those are third parties or people who are highly attacked or contractors or anyone who you can't have the same level of technical trust in. Or maybe you're just starting with your generic user. I was actually having a fascinating conversation with the lead security architect at one of the big four consulting organizations who are well on their way to zero trust at this point. And they basically said, well, we had to do both, but we frankly got more bang for our buck on the right side of this, meaning we started with the generic user, any new employee that we're hiring, and obviously this is an organization with over 100,000 people in it, so they're hiring people all the time, and they wanted to make sure that that baseline, what should every single user have access to, was straightforward. And that might be, to Chase's earlier slide, cloud-based email, word processing, a couple of different internal systems, which are frankly cloud-based and driven by identity and access management controls. But if you're not actually enforcing that and you're giving them access to this big flat legacy network where they can access literally thousands, possibly millions of different assets that they're not specifically entitled to, that's simply going to make the zero trust hill steeper and steeper and steeper as you drift away from what is an ideal configuration. So let's get into the specifics of that. How is this supposed to work? Well, you need something that connects your users to applications and data centers as well as the cloud. You need some way to do centralized policy management. You have to then do that policy management in a way that incorporates the core tenets of zero trust: device trust, user trust, and whether that user is in fact entitled to access the thing that they're trying to access. And you want that network to be different than the networks that came before it. There is no reason to recreate the sins of the IPv4-based past when it comes to setting up this access. So sure, you have to do some tunneling, you have to probably use IPsec and some of the protocols that will still underlie network communications until possibly the heat death of the universe, but ideally you can do that in a slightly better way. And to Chase's last point, if it is done in a transparent, fast way and it's a great user experience, then you're really getting somewhere. And critically, you're going to have to be able to do that across both managed and personal devices. So you probably need to support something that looks like an agent. This is sort of, if you want to think about it that way, an always-on VPN style client, but one that doesn't really interrupt the user's workflow. So the UX has to be great. But you're also going to have to support browser-based access. You're going to have to support things like machine-to-machine access and a lot of the other permutations there. So what does that then look like from a component perspective? Well, you have to have at least some ability to have a cloud network. That's not to say you can't reuse your current network, but this is not the sort of battle that's going to be defined by vendors who love proxies versus vendors who love firewalls. Honestly, lots of these different things are going to have to work differently in different ways. The second piece that I think is pretty critical is that, yeah, you will have to use different points of presence in the cloud just because the architecture is fundamentally different than what came before it. Bonus points if you can do the third bullet, which is not something that's part of every single implementation of zero trust, but if you can take that legacy network where packets were packets and you were routing them based on firewall rule sets and ACLs and all of the traditional things that we always had trouble configuring, segmenting into VLANs and doing micro-segmentation around, and instead embed packet with some notion of identity, Zero Trust is a lot easier in different ways. And then, of course, that's always got to be always on. So let me talk about real quickly how that looks in practice. Because frankly, there's going to be two different flavors there. Right? You have posture checks that have to occur on the device side. You then probably need MFA. Like, this is one of the core tenets of any Zero Trust implementation, but really it is a baseline security control that everyone should factor into their Zero Trust decisions. That should then go into a POP. That could be a cloud POP. That could be your own network as sort of an overlay. And that then is your core architectural component where you can actually say, this is the thing that you're supposed to have access to. If it's in a legacy data center, maybe that then talks to a VM, which gives you an ability to say, no matter where that user is coming from, no matter what device that user is on, it's the user's identity that drives the access control decision. I don't actually care about the underlying network at all, as long as the user is given access to the things they should have access to. Now, the other things you can do are basically take cloud services and apply Zero Trust to them as well. So you don't necessarily need more than, and for those of you who are technical, you can call that the 2 UDP ports that you would need from an outbound perspective. You don't actually need to let the world and the IPv4 internet access what you have in Amazon. There's no real reason to do that. You can actually have that come from your own Zero Trust network if you're using client-based access. So in practice, what might this look like? So say I have a developer. That developer is a contractor. Maybe I employ them. They're based in Hyderabad. Right? They need access to one of my cloud applications. My cloud applications run in AWS West, which I believe is in Oregon, if I remember correctly. I have a source code repo and a Jira system. Those are on-prem servers that live in my data center. My data center is somewhere in California. Now, what am I going to do to actually give that developer access? Am I going to put them on a VPN? Possibly. Legacy VPNs would probably give them access to a bunch more resources than I need, because my source code repo and my Jira box are not on their own little subsegment of our enterprise network. Maybe they should be. Of course they should be. But that's work that never got done, and that would probably break things if I tried to do it today. So what do I want? What I want is the ability to give that contractor access to only what that contractor needs. Maybe it's Jira, the source code repo, the Jenkins instance I have that runs in the cloud, and a couple of applications that they're working on that run on AWS. That's the policy, and that's what I need to enforce. And I want to have MFA so I can actually trust that that person is who they say they are when they log in that way. That's the sort of thing that Zero Trust allows you to do, and is one of the really powerful ways to kind of start. But maybe I don't even trust that. I want a contractor who only has to use a different style production application that runs through a browser, and I want to do my own version of what Google did with the BeyondCorp project. Well, browser-based access is simpler, but you can still do MFA. You can still route that traffic the exact same way, and you can still control access to things that live in the data center, things that live in the cloud. It doesn't really matter, because Zero Trust is, again, not about that. So a couple of quick case studies before we open it up for questions. Well, this is a born-in-the-cloud tech company. They, I believe they're you'd call them ride-hailing. And they have basically never, ever, ever bought a server. They've never bought a firewall. They have no network. Most of their users go straight to the internet and then to a lot of different things that live in the cloud. There are DevOps teams and analyst teams that are full-time employees, and they're actually using an agent. They end up going to resources that live in AWS all around the world, and there are business users that don't actually need access to anything but the application layer. They're just working through a web interface. So they don't actually even need anything installed on their devices. They can use a mobile app because everyone's got a mobile browser. They can use their own device that doesn't have to be managed. But of course, you're still implementing posture checks, all of the classic things you'd want to do to make sure that the device itself is not compromised. That then leads to microsegmented access. And when this organization rolled out Zero Trust in this way, they frankly got to skip a whole lot of the traditional steps. So I think this actually has some fantastic lessons for even enterprises that were not born in the cloud. Is if you are standing up brand new things in AWS, there's no reason to be constrained by your prior thinking. As Chase said, we've spent tens of billions of dollars every year and actually crossed that $100 billion threshold in 2019 in terms of security spending, and it has not necessarily worked all that well. The cloud gives you an opportunity to rethink a lot of that. So even if you do it for a subset of your users, maybe it's just the DevOps team or just a subset of business users, which may or may not even be your full-time employees, that's a fantastic on-ramp to Zero Trust. And it's got tremendous ROI, because this is the sort of thing that, again, is driven by a single policy engine sitting in the middle. So it really is the same spirit as Google implemented with BeyondCorp. Now, I don't want to go into all of the things that make this work in a tremendous amount of detail, but you do have to have these components. So for those of you who are technical, an identity provider, some way to log in, whether that's, the Oktas or the Microsofts of the world, that is really, really critical here. You can't really do it without that piece. At the same time, you also want to have something that really looks like an application gateway. This is where you want to do things like SSL or TLS termination. Ideally, it's going to be easily deployed because you're going to need it in things like on-prem data centers if you were not born in the cloud. And it needs to be easy to deploy. For apps, you also need SSL-based access, and really there, you're also looking to do kind of reverse proxy style functionality. Critically, you also want to be able to keep each user separate from each other user, so there's some session management that plays into that as well. An agent, unfortunately, as much as we all hate agents, I do think that when we look back 3 years from now, anyone who doesn't have some replacement for their current generation of VPN that gives you the ability to, at least for corporate managed devices, have that always on VPN that can do not only the network security side of things, but also the Zero Trust access side of things, is going to be behind the industry curve. And this will allow you to certainly replace legacy VPNs for sure. You can iron out a lot of the kinks in the architecture that were accumulated over the years, and there's ROI in that. But really, I do think there is a really critical component there that can't be skipped over. The middle piece is perhaps the most important. Microservices to basically do all of the stuff that makes Zero Trust work, both the plumbing, enforcement of the roles and privileges, which are probably going to live in other systems. This is a really incredibly important architectural component of Zero Trust that I think everybody needs to consider. And then finally, you really want this to work like what I would call an overlay network. Now, there's innumerable debates about, do you do this as a cloud-hosted proxy? Do you do this as a cloud-hosted firewall? Do you do this as something that we've never done before? And I would actually say what the Zero Trust network should most look like is an overlay. I will maybe give you an example of how we do it ourselves. We just use IPv6, right? Because that always-on VPN agent, that browser-based agent, they can all have their own unique IPv6 identities. IPv6 has 13 undecillion addresses to use, and we can cryptographically embed things like identity in the packets themselves when we use IPv6. And with IPv6, it can run on top of any existing network. It can run over the cloud. It doesn't really matter. The underlying plumbing, which you can NAT back to IPv4 wherever you need to, is irrelevant. What matters most is that, say, that Indian contractor I have in Hyderabad, they go straight out to the internet, the IPv4 internet, and they're coming from an IPv6 address. That IPv6 address should be able to go to only what they're supposed to go to. So whether I let them on my corporate network and they can only come out at Jira and the source code repo, or whether they're on the public internet and they, from their specific IPv6 address, can get to what I have that they need in AWS, the overlay is just the way that makes sense. Plus, it means you don't have to perform open heart surgery on all that networking gear that you've spent so much time and money on over the last 2, 3, possibly 4 decades, depending on how long your organization has been in business. So those are the sorts of solution blocks that if you're a Zero Trust architect, if you're a security architect, I would urge you to start thinking about in terms of the plumbing of how you're going to make this work. And so one last case study before we open it up for questions, because we've got a few of them. One of them is actually accessing things like customer environments if you're a service provider. Maybe you even need to simulate what happens when you're coming from different geographies around the world. And Zero Trust can actually be a fantastic business enabler, as Chase spoke about in this context. So the overlay network can very easily talk to just something like Amazon, but also you can make it look like you're coming from anywhere. There's so many advantages to taking a new, fresh look at the networking layer when you do Zero Trust access, that you can do the sorts of things that benefit the business in profound ways, like this organization was able to do with third-party access. And they actually figured out, is the experience great for users coming in from Italy? What about those coming in from South Africa? They can simulate all of that because Zero Trust gives you a fantastic platform in which to actually test things that matter in digital transformation and ultimately matter to the business. So with that, I'm going to stop boring you all with slides because we do have some really cool questions. I'll start with the first one. What is a VAP, please? That's an excellent one. I should have defined that term. We call that a very attacked person. So a very attacked person is like those 66% of you who don't really want to trust your users. In most organizations, you will see that a very small percentage of the users get most of the threat load. And there's lots of different ways to observe that. You can look at password spray attacks on Office 365. You can look at inbound phishing attempts. You can look at inbound social engineering attempts. And very often that will actually trace back to something that somebody's put in on their LinkedIn profile that, hey, I handle accounts payable for this massive Fortune 1000 organization. But either way, your very attacked people often form a huge part of risk. And it is one of the things we've seen be really successful in practice when you start with the Zero Trust project, because I can give you an example of an organization that has 450,000 users. If you looked at the ones that were persistently attacked, and you of course have to do some threat scoring and lots of ingredients go into making the sausage, but there were only about 497 of them, I remember that number pretty specifically, that were always persistently attacked in that organization. So doing Zero Trust for those 500 users out of 450,000 was the bang for the security buck for that team. Other high-risk user categories, of course, are interesting to use Zero Trust for, like third parties and contractors and other users that matter a lot. Maybe a risk is your application developers, right? Because they have access to your source code. That might be the most important asset. And so controlling their access might be the thing you start with. But those are different flavors, really, of I think what Chase was talking about in terms of starting with users and figuring out how to take that into a proper Zero Trust architecture. So with that, I have a couple of other questions that I think are going to be maybe a good one for Chase to answer. So what percentage of organizations do you think have actually gotten started with Zero Trust?
The data comes back on that. I mean, we've talked globally to a few hundred organizations, and most of them came back as they've gotten at least somewhat started on it. Now, we've got research to do to say, well, what is that start and how far down the rabbit hole have they gone? But the last numbers I saw was almost 70% of the organizations that we had polled and reached out to had said that they had started down a, quote, Zero Trust initiative. So, that's pretty substantial numbers.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So the other one that I think is we can probably both weigh in on, the question is, how does Zero Trust work in a Citrix environment? I will say in my experience, people often use things like Citrix and other thin clients in order to facilitate the sort of access control they were having a hard time doing with traditional network segmentation. So the classic example of that is I have third-party contractors somewhere else in the world, and they need to log into one specific application and do their work. And so I'm going to give them a VPN, I'm going to give them a Citrix thin client, and I'm not going to give them anything else. I've seen actually Zero Trust replace that, especially if that application isn't a thick client one and can be browser-based. But Chase, if you have any other thoughts on that, that would be interesting.
Yeah, I've seen mainly the approach has been to try and figure out ways to sort of leverage what's already there, and the client sort of side approach seems to be the predominant one. I don't know that there is a best way to kind of skin that cat, but anything you can do to, I personally think, to leverage virtualization and the cloud is where you kind of want to wind up.
Yeah, could not agree more. So, and with that, I think we're out of time today. You probably know who Proofpoint is if you've attended this webinar, but just a quick view into what we do. We obviously focus on protecting those users, which 2/3 of you were probably correct in saying you are at least likely to trust. Thanks for your time and attention today. Hope you found the content valuable. Thanks again to Dr. Chase Cunningham for that invaluable insight. And have a great day, everyone.